In a small, quiet town hidden between the hills and the sea, there lived a people who knew how to endure. They had waited for years, decades even. For change. For breakthrough. For someone to notice the weight they carried. Some prayed. Some gave up. Most just got quiet. The nights were long. The wind often howled like a lament through the broken shutters. And beneath the stars, the only sound was a question whispered by trembling lips, God. Did you forget us? But above the clouds, in the unseen realm, an angel stirred. Far beyond human sight, in the courts of heaven, stood a radiant figure. He was not like the others, this one carried urgency in his eyes. His name was Elion, and he had been watching. Watching the girl who cried herself to sleep. Watching the man who still prayed though his heart had hardened. Watching the mother who gave away her last piece of bread. Watching the pastor whose small church held only 5 faithful members, yet he preached like the angels listened. Elion turned to the throne. Father, the cries have reached the tipping point. Permission to go. To move. To deliver the word. The voice from the throne answered not in thunder, but in holy fire, go. Tell the weary, help is on the way. The next morning, a strange breeze flowed through the valley. It wasn't harsh, but it carried weight. Children turned their heads. Animals grew still. The elderly blinked as if remembering something long forgotten. Atop the mountain, a child named Tova looked toward the sky and whispered, Mama. I feel something coming. All across the valley, heaven had marked certain souls. Not the loud ones. Not the polished ones. But the quiet warriors, the ones who had warred in prayer behind closed doors. The ones who gave when they had little. The ones who stayed when they could have left. Elion was sent for them. He appeared not in grand displays, but in dreams, in moments between sleep and waking, in whispers that sounded like wind brushing across the soul. And the message was always the same, don't give up. Help is on the way. Sariel was a seamstress in her 60s. No family. No audience. Only fabric, faith, and fading strength. For 17 years, she had prayed the same prayer, God, restore what I lost. She never saw much change. But that day, as she sat beside her window stitching by candlelight, Elion passed by her home. And without entering, he whispered to her soul, Heaven hasn't ignored you. Help is on the way. She didn't hear it with her ears, but she dropped her needle, clutched her chest, and wept. Not from pain, but because hope had returned. That evening, in another part of the valley, a young man named Elias stood atop the church roof. He looked over the fields where nothing had grown for seasons. He looked at the sky, cloudless and cruel. And he screamed, if you're still there, do something. It was raw. Desperate. Honest. And heaven honored it. Elion, hearing the cry, landed beside him, not visible to human eyes, but with presence so real that Elias dropped to his knees. And the angel spoke, you were chosen to feel what others refused to. But this isn't the end. This is the turning. Help is on the way. By midnight, something shifted. A woman who hadn't dreamed in years saw a vision of rain falling on parched land. A little boy spoke in his sleep, the angel is here. Don't cry anymore, Mama. And in the spirit realm, fires were being lit. Assignments were being released. And doors that had been shut for generations began to tremble on their hinges. Heaven was not sleeping. The waiting was almost over. By morning, something had shifted in the land. The trees whispered secrets. The rivers shimmered with unfamiliar clarity. And the ground itself felt like it was waiting for something. The valley had grown used to long, slow silence. But now, the silence trembled with anticipation. Old wells, once dry, began to echo. Wind swept over rooftops and fields, not with destruction, but with urgency. Something is coming. Something holy. Elias hadn't slept well, but when he opened his eyes, he wasn't the same man. Something had been deposited into him. It wasn't physical. It was a knowing. The kind of inner surge that whispers, "You were born for this hour." He didn't understand it yet. But he couldn't stop pacing. He couldn't stop looking toward the mountain. And for the first time in years, he wanted to pray again. Sariel dreamt she was young again. She was running through fields of golden wheat. She could feel joy in her chest, like the sun had settled inside her. But then she stopped. In her dream, a glowing man stood ahead of her on the path. His voice was like many waters. "You cried, and heaven listened. You waited, and heaven moved. Now rise. The garment you are weaving is for the promise about to be fulfilled." She awoke in tears, clutching her chest, and her hands glowed for a moment, as if kissed by divine fire. Elion no longer remained hidden. At twilight, he appeared at the village square, not to everyone, but to those marked by waiting. Children saw him first. Then the old. Then those with hearts wide open. He said no words. He only held a scroll in his hand that shimmered like lightning. On the scroll was written, "Divine intervention in motion." And then, just as quickly, he vanished, but the atmosphere remained drenched in expectation. That night, Elias called together the ones he knew had not given up. Sariel, a young widow named Moriah, an orphan shepherd boy, a blind singer named Kellan, the old pastor, who still anointed his pulpit with oil even when no one came. They didn't come with strategies. They came with scars and faith. And somehow, that was enough. Around the fire, they prayed. Not loud. Not fancy. Just real. And heaven leaned in. Back in the spirit realm, Elion returned to the council of angels. They watched the valley now ignited in spiritual flame. One angel turned to him and asked, "Shall we go?" Elion nodded. "They're ready. The waiting has birthed wisdom. The tears have purified the atmosphere. It's time." From the heavens, legions were dispatched, each carrying an assignment, each racing toward the weary. And earth, though unaware, began to tremble in welcome. That very night, strange lights danced across the heavens. Stars pulsed like hearts. The moon turned gold. Even the most skeptical looked up and felt a question rise in their chest: is God coming closer? Yes. Yes, he was. Before the dawn could break, before the first miracle could bloom, Elion stood once more over the valley and declared with fire in his voice, to the weary and the waiting, the delay is almost over. The answer is en route. Help is on the way. Morning broke differently. The air was rich, thick with promise, yet oddly quiet. People expected thunder, light, revival bursting through the clouds. Instead, it came gently. Quietly. Through people. A stranger arrived in town. Dust on his cloak. A glimmer in his eyes. He said little. But his presence carried weight. And Sariel? She felt it instantly. He's not just a man. He's been with heaven. He didn't go to the powerful. He didn't knock on government doors. He walked to the widow's cottage. He helped carry a disabled child up a hill. He sat beside Kellan, the blind singer, and whispered songs only angels knew. People began to talk. Who is he? Why does it feel like my heart understands him even when he says nothing? Elias followed him, confused but drawn. And then, the stranger turned and said something that changed everything: "I've come because your prayers outran your pain." That week, miracles didn't fall from the sky. They were woven into bread shared between neighbors. In rain falling on the dry field after years of drought. In old debts cancelled. In reconciliations between estranged families. The people wanted lightning. But heaven gave life. And the angel Elion stood silently, watching as the people finally understood. Sometimes, help doesn't roar. Sometimes, help whispers. On the seventh day, the stranger stood before the church, now filled to the walls. He opened his mouth for the first full message, "You prayed for help." But heaven didn't just send assistance. Heaven sent presence. He lifted his hand, and for a moment, the people saw him as he truly was, a messenger of heaven. A carrier of glory. It was Elion, in human form. Gasps filled the room. Tears flowed freely. Every heart broke open under the weight of the revelation. God had not just sent help. God had come himself, through his servant. One by one, people stepped forward. A mute girl spoke for the first time. A man with a deformed hand stretched it out whole. Sariel's old spine straightened with no pain. The church roof, once caving in, seemed to glow with light. But the greatest healing was internal, the shame was lifted. The fatigue erased. The fear dissolved. Their waiting had not been in vain. Their weeping had been turned to oil. Elias couldn't hold it back anymore. He fell before Elion and cried like a child. "Why us? Why now?" Elion knelt beside him and whispered. "Because you did not let go when heaven seemed silent. You waited. You wept. And heaven never wastes the cries of the faithful." He placed his hand on Elias' head. "Help has arrived. But now, you will become help for others." That night, under the stars, Elion called together a group, those who had once waited, wept, wondered if God had forgotten. He opened a golden scroll. Its glow was unlike anything they had seen. And inscribed in a language they could feel more than read, were names. Their names. "Heaven has remembered you not just as survivors," he said. "But as carriers. Messengers. Flames." He passed the scroll to Sariel first. Her old hands trembled, but her voice didn't. "I am ready." Moriah, the young widow, received her scroll next. It read, "You will comfort the grieving and rebuild broken homes." She wept, not because she felt small, but because she finally understood the pain hadn't been punishment. It had been preparation. "I lost everything," she whispered. "But I gained the one thing that matters, God's trust." Kellan, the blind musician, was given no scroll. Instead, Elion handed him a harp. "Your eyes may not open on earth," he said, "but your sound will open the eyes of the nations." Kellan played one note, and light fell over the entire valley. The heavens thundered, "Let the praises rise from the places that once echoed only pain." Elias and the others stood in a circle. Elion raised his hand and declared, "You were once the waiting. Now you are the answer. Go. Release the same comfort that found you." Suddenly, tongues of fire hovered over each one. Their mouths opened, and languages they never studied flowed out, prophetic tongues of healing, direction, revelation. The fire didn't burn their bodies. It ignited their callings. Word spread. The once forgotten valley became a source of revival. Pilgrims came from nearby towns. Miracles were no longer rare, they became daily signs. Fields that had lain barren for years burst into bloom. Broken marriages were restored. The depressed danced again. But more than the miracles, it was the presence that changed everything. You could feel heaven in the streets. Peace hung in the air like incense. Even the wind carried worship. But with breakthrough came resistance. One night, Elion gathered the leaders and whispered, "Now that you carry light, darkness will notice." Heaven had not only sent help, it had raised warriors. Guard your hearts. Protect your unity. Your strength is in your love. The enemy would try to sow jealousy, fear, and distraction. But the valley had been refined in waiting. They would not be broken now. On the 40th day, something unprecedented happened. A river that had dried up 15 years ago burst forth again. Water gushed from the mountain as if commanded by God himself. People shouted. Children danced in the current. Elders fell to their knees. And Elion said, "This is the outward sign of the inward shift. Where there was once dryness, now there is overflow. Heaven has remembered the people." It began with stillness. The sun hung higher than usual in the sky, as though heaven pressed pause. People stepped outside and instinctively held their breath. Even the birds stopped singing. It was not fear that gripped them. It was awe. Something was coming. No, something was arriving, and this time, it would not leave. Sariel finished sewing a radiant robe she had been working on for weeks. She didn't know why she made it or for whom. But when she held it up, the room filled with light. The stitches shimmered like threads of gold. Her eyes welled with tears, and her heart knew, "I've completed what I was born for." She folded it neatly and left it on the altar. Then she walked outside and joined the others, the ones who had once waited and now witnessed. The valley, once a place of shadows and drought, had become a place of pilgrimage. A sanctuary for the broken. A lighthouse for nations. They didn't have riches, but they had presence. Not popularity, but power. People who visited often said, "I don't know what this is, but I never want to leave." And Elion would smile and whisper, "It's heaven's breath lingering." On the 50th day, Elion stood again in the center of the valley. But this time, it wasn't only the valley watching. The clouds parted. The veil thinned. Multitudes from all over the region gathered, their hearts burning with reverence. And Elion, glowing brighter than before, declared, "To the weary who didn't quit. To the waiting who didn't walk away. Heaven was never blind to your cries. You were not forgotten. You were forged. What has come will remain. What began in fire shall stay in glory." Elias stepped forward, once the desperate, now the steady. Elion removed a small crown from beneath his cloak, formed of olive branches, gold, and flame. "This is not for kings," Elion said. "It is for servants who stayed when it hurt." He placed it on Elias' head. And the people wept. "You are not the help. You are the legacy of heaven's help." Elion didn't leave. He remained, not as a visible figure, but as presence. And the people no longer waited in despair. They moved forward with fire. Churches were planted. Orphans were adopted. Songs were written that brought healing. Prayers were prayed that shook governments. And above all, a banner was raised over the valley. It read, "Glory remains where the waiting was honored." And now, dear reader, if you find yourself weary, still waiting. If your tears have not yet turned to laughter. If your prayers still feel unanswered. Let this story speak not only to your mind, but to your spirit. Because the same God who visited the valley is the God who sees you. And if you're reading this, it's not by accident. The angel is whispering again. Don't give up. Help is still on the way. And this time, it carries your name.